For almost 20 years, the largest predator of its kind ever discovered sat in a museum drawer in northern Colombia. Nobody knew what it was. A single leg bone, recovered from the eroding red rock near a fossil bed called La Venta, and filed away as one more unidentified fragment. It waited there through 2 decades of dust and silence. Then, in 2023, a paleontologist named Federico de Grange walked into that collection and picked it up. De Grange had spent almost 20 years studying one specific kind of animal, and the moment he turned the bone over in his hands, he saw a shape near the front of it, a feature that appears in the legs of only one group of creatures that has ever lived. He knew, instantly, what he was holding. It was a terror bird, a real one, and it was larger than any terror bird science had ever found. That is the strange thing about these animals. Almost everything we know about them, we are still learning, from bones that have been sitting under our noses the entire time. And almost everything you think you know about them is too small. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what that bone was, and why the true story of the terror bird is so much bigger and so much worse than the one you were told. Because the terror bird most people picture, a big, dumb, prehistoric ostrich with a temper, barely resembles the animal that actually lived. The real one was faster, stranger, built, from beak to foot, as a precision instrument for killing, and every part of the story you are about to hear is drawn from real fossils, real excavations, and the researchers who named them. Nothing here is exaggerated. With an animal like this one, it never needs to be. Picture South America, roughly 40 million years ago. An island continent, cut off from the rest of the world, running its own evolutionary experiment. On nearly every other landmass on Earth, the top predators are mammals, cats, dogs, things with long teeth and 4 legs. Not here. Here, the animal at the very top of the food chain is a bird, not a scavenger, picking at the leftovers of something fiercer. The single most dangerous animal for miles in any direction, and it wore feathers, walked on 2 legs, and could not fly a single inch. They are called Phorusrhacids, the family name almost no one uses, because everyone knows them by the name that stuck, terror birds. For a stretch of time lasting tens of millions of years, they were the dominant land predators of an entire continent, flightless, long-legged, built to run prey down and finish it on the spot. Their closest living relatives are the Siriemas, leggy South American birds that still hunt today by snatching up snakes and lizards and beating them against the ground until they break. Hold that image. Now scale it up, far up. The smallest terror birds were about the size of a modern turkey. The largest stood taller than a grown man, carrying a head longer than your entire arm. And that head is where this story truly begins. Because it was never the size of it that made these birds so extraordinary. It was what they had learned to do with it. In 2010, a team led by the same specialist from our cold open, Federico de Grange, published a study in the journal PLOS One that quietly rewrote what we thought we knew. They took the skull of a mid-sized terror bird called Andalgalornis, a species that lived in what is now Catamarca, Argentina, about 6 million years ago, and they ran it through a CT scanner and a stress simulation, the same kind of engineering analysis used to test the parts of an aircraft. What came back was not a normal bird skull. Most birds have light, flexible skulls, laced with tiny joints that let the bones give a little. Andalgalornis had fused those joints shut. Its skull had become a single rigid beam, extraordinarily strong front to back, but weak from side to side. And its tall, hooked beak was hollow. Put those 3 facts together, and a very particular hunter comes into focus. This was not an animal that could seize large, struggling prey and thrash it from side to side. The simulation showed its own skull would risk cracking under that sideways stress, so it did something far more elegant. It struck. It drove that reinforced skull straight down and forward like a hatchet, powered by heavy neck muscles, then pulled back, with the hooked tip, to open the wound. Then, it stepped away, and struck again. Here is the detail that changes everything. When the team measured the actual force of its bite, it was modest, unremarkable, for an animal that size, and that is the point. This was never a creature that overpowered its prey. It was a creature that outaimed it. The brilliance was in the precision, not the power. The researchers compared it to a boxer. Strike, retreat, strike, retreat. Landing clean, vertical blows, until whatever it faced simply stopped moving. Not a peck, not a bite. A repeated, targeted, downward strike from a skull, as long as your forearm, delivered by an animal that could outrun you. And Andalgalornis was only a middleweight. To see how large this design could truly get, we have to travel south, to a hillside in Patagonia. In March of 1999, a high school student named Guillermo Aguirre Zabala was fossil hunting near the tiny railway village of Comayo in the Rio Negro province of Argentine Patagonia. About 100 meters from the train station, he found a skull. Not a fragment, a nearly complete skull. And when the paleontologists Sarah Bertelli, Luis Chiappe, and Claudia Tambusi described it in 2007, they realized it broke a record that still stands today. The skull measured just under 72 centimeters long, 28 inches, the largest head of any bird known to science, living or extinct, in the entire history of the group. They named the animal Kelenken, after a spirit in the mythology of the Tehuelche people of Patagonia, a giant bird of prey. It stood close to 3 meters tall, around 10 feet, higher than the ceiling of the room you are most likely sitting in right now. I will admit something here. I have stood beside a cast of that skull, and the measurement is not the part that stays with you. What stays with you is imagining that head, rising higher than a doorway, and coming down, fast, again and again. But Kelenken only holds the record for the head. The bone in that Colombian drawer, the one from our cold open, was about to challenge the record for the whole animal. When de Grange and his colleagues, including Siobhan Cook of Johns Hopkins and Andres Link of the University of the Andes, published their analysis in late 2024, the numbers were astonishing. The creature that Shinbone belonged to stood over 2.5 meters tall, weighed more than 150 kilograms, and was somewhere between 5 and 20% larger than any terror bird ever recorded. It lived about 12 million years ago, and it remains the northernmost terror bird ever found in South America. Stand beside it, and you would be looking up at an animal tall enough to see clean over the roof of a family car. And then there is the part that no one saw coming. That bone carries marks. Deep punctures, most likely left by Phorusrhacids, an extinct caiman that grew up to 9 meters long, 30 feet of crocodilian. The single largest terror bird we have ever found was, in all likelihood, hunted and killed by something even larger than itself. Which leaves one obvious question. If these giants ruled South America, did any of them ever get out? One of them did. In the winter of 1961, 2 amateur fossil collectors, Benjamin Waller and Robert Allen, were searching the bed of the Santa Fe River in northern Florida when they lifted out part of an ankle bone. 2 years later, the ornithologist Pierce Broadcorb described it as a new genus, Titanus walleri, named for Waller himself, a terror bird, in Florida. Picture that for a moment. The same warm coastline people drive to today, and standing in the shallows, a flightless killer, as tall as a grown man. For a long time, that seemed impossible. Terror birds were a South American story, sealed off on their island continent. But around 3 million years ago, the Isthmus of Panama rose out of the sea and bridged two landmasses that had been apart for tens of millions of years. Animals poured across in both directions, an event geologists call the Great American Biotic Interchange. And one of the things that walked north was a terror bird. Titanus fossils have since surfaced in Texas and California as well. This was no accidental crossing. It was an arrival. For years, the legend grew taller than the evidence. People pictured Titanus with a grasping clawed forelimb, a hook on its wing, and imagined it surviving late enough to meet the first humans in North America. Both ideas turned out to be far shakier than the headlines. In 2007, a team led by Bruce McFadden redated the Florida fossils using rare earth chemistry and concluded that Titanus vanished roughly 2 million years ago, long before any human ever set foot on the continent. So no person ever stood face to face with one. And yet, that near miss, that gap of a mere couple of million years, is the thing that lingers. Because of how recently, on the long clock of this planet, all of it came to an end. Let me leave you with the pattern, not the list. Terror birds were not a brief experiment. They stood at the top of an entire continent for something close to 60 million years, a reign longer than almost any line of mammal carnivores has ever managed. They outcompeted the cats and dogs of their world so completely that, in their corner of the planet, the top of the food chain wore feathers instead of fur. And then they were gone. So completely that most people alive today have no idea they ever existed at all. An entire dynasty of giant, warm-blooded hunters, erased so cleanly from memory that we had to dig them back out of the rock just to believe them. Here is the thought that stays with me. The single largest one we have ever identified was not pulled from the ground in some triumphant expedition. It sat in a museum drawer for almost 20 years, unrecognized, until one person happened to pick it up, which means our picture of how vast and how astonishing these animals became is still being drawn, right now, from bones already resting in collections, waiting for the right pair of eyes. So the real question was never whether the terror bird was worse than you think. It is what else is still in the drawer. Next time, we go after the animal that very likely brought down the largest terror bird of them all, Phorusrhacids, a 30-foot caiman that treated a 150-kilogram apex predator as a single meal. If you want the real, sourced story of the giants that outlasted and outhunted the terror birds, the ones most channels get completely wrong, subscribe now, so the next drawer we opens for you too. And before you go, tell me one thing in the comments. Which lost giant should we bring back next? The caiman that hunted the terror bird, or the very last terror bird of them all? Tell me below.